JLF's Brave New World welcomes you back to the second session of the day. We've now exceeded over 2 million views across our 90 episodes. And as we lead into our 100th episode, we would love you to post a short video on how JLF's Brave New World has impacted your worldview. You can post it on our email ID, contact@teamworkarts.com. Those of you who missed our earlier sessions, defining luxury, Tarun Tehliani and Himanshu Vardhan, in conversation with Nanita Kalra and all of the others featuring His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Margaret Atwood, Oran Pamuk, Howard Jacobson, you can catch these on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, or on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Our official radio partner is Red FM, Bajate Raho. Our next session is Writing from the Brink. Brian Keenan in conversation with Salil Tripathi. Brian Keenan became headline news when he was kidnapped by the Shi'ite militiamen in 1985 and held hostage in Beirut for 4.5 years. The intensity and horror of that traumatic encounter is recounted in An Evil Cradling. His next book, I'll Tell Me Ma, is a memoir about growing up in Belfast. In conversation with writer, journalist, and human rights activist Salil Tripathi, he speaks of the trauma of incarceration and the will to survive. Brian Keenan has worked as a teacher and community arts worker. In 1985, he took up a post at the American University of Beirut, where he was abducted and held hostage by Islamic terrorists for 5 years. 2 years after his release, he wrote an account of his captivity entitled An Evil Cradling, which has since won 4 national and international awards. He has since written 4 other books, Between Extremes, 4 Quarters of Light, Turlo, and I'll Tell Me Ma. Salil Tripathi is the author of Offense, The Hindu Case, The Colonel Who Would Not Repent, and Detours, Song of the Open Road. He also chairs PEN International Writers in Prison Committee. Please do remember to comment and ask questions by typing it in the comment section below. And in case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. And of course, if we drop off, just hang in there, and we'll be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, Brian Keenan in conversation with Salil Tripathi. Salil, over to you.
Thank you, Sanjay. And hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. A very strange kind of setting to have a conversation for a Jaipur Literature Festival. Usually you have lots of people milling about and curious about the audience, but we have to do what we have. And it is indeed a brave new world we are in. We are in a very unusual time. And also we are talking about moments on the brink. I'm going to be speaking to Brian, with whom I had the privilege and honor of having a conversation last year at the festival in Belfast. So I would urge those of you interested in Brian to certainly check that video out, which is on the JLF channel as well. We are going to take that conversation forward, but we will be visiting some of the themes we discussed then, because there is always a first time and sometimes it's worth recounting. The most remarkable thing about Brian is, of course, the fact that the warmth of his humor, the tenacity of his courage, and the spirit of compassion that he personifies with what he has been through and what he feels about what he has gone through. Brian, we are in an unusual time, as I said. We are in an enforced lockdown and imagining what being imprisoned might feel like. We are at home against our will, but we also have our comforts. I'm able to talk to you and many more who have signed on to this festival today. I'm able to buy most of what I need. I'm able to step out to, and in many societies, I wouldn't get punished for doing that. I'm able to get my basic needs at my doorstep, and I have to follow some rules for my good and for other people's good. So this is not really captivity. Your experience was cruel and different. You've spoken about it before, but there are probably viewers tuning in today who don't know. Take us to Beirut. What took you there and what happened?
It was a kind of strange choice. I suppose coming from Belfast and going to Beirut, it was a bit like from the frying pan to the fire. That wasn't my experience, but I've always wanted to travel. I think travel is about enrichment and opening yourself to new experiences. However, the experience I had in Beirut was not pleasant. I went there because I was particularly interested in the Palestinian situation, and I thought this was a way to understand better, to be there, to meet, to talk, to visit Shatila and Sabra. I had not intended to stay as long as I did. I was only going for a year, perhaps two. I like teaching young adults, and I find when I was in Lebanon that I had to work very hard because my students, when you ask them to do anything, they don't, and they always prepared and came prepared. I missed them dreadfully, and that I was only there for a very short time. And you know, when you just begin to make relationships outside your own cultural understanding, which is where the enrichment comes from, they become kind of permanent. You make friends very quickly when you're a stranger. However, the friends I ended up with were not easy to get along with. It was kind of like 5 years in an inhospitable and profoundly damaging landscape and confinement. It wasn't a landscape. The cell was 6 foot by 4 foot. And you got out in the morning to go to the toilet and came back. The door shut, and that was it. And the light went out, and that was it until the next morning. You didn't know it was the next morning because you had no clock on the wall, apart from the call to prayer, which told you it was the dawn of a new day. And that was all. Surprisingly, in those situations, now that I reflect back on it, and I don't speak Arabic, I come to find the call to prayer early, which told me it was a new day, but it was strangely comforting to hear this religious chant in a foreign language, and you're in a hole in the ground with men who were kind of thoroughly evil, but somehow it was enriching. It was like someone put an arm around you. And the irony of it is, one of the worst of my captors was the one who sang this call to prayer so sweetly. He had the voice of an angel, but the mind of a poisonous snake, unfortunately. Those were the circumstances.
Right. You recently spoke, at the former correspondent in the BBC, and about a 9-minute piece you did called The Visitation of the Magaya, where you were kind of reflecting on what lockdown does to people, what being incarcerated means. Compared to what you went through, what others are going through is millions of that, or billions of that. But it has an impact on one's mind. People are talking about mental illness. People are talking about how to keep the spirits alive. Even the London Mayor, Sadiq Khan, spoke about mental health yesterday in one of his interviews. So I'm just curious, what keeps people going? What is the philosophical underpinning behind this?
I don't know. I think there's a process that happens when, well, certainly for me, it was a case of, I spent about 9 months in solitary confinement in this small, dark cell. But then they give you a stub of a candle to eat your one meal a day by. And that was your brief period of light. But I think what happens in those processes of extreme isolation, with all the time horror hovering about in the cell, waiting for the next beating, was that you go through a process of a kind of emotional and psychological meltdown. So the person who you thought yourself to be, the person who you thought yourself capable of being, disappeared very rapidly, and not in any way that you could prevent this happening. But I don't know. I suppose at some point, I remember particularly badly being beaten or something, and something. So the me that had been taken to that cell had kind of evaporated quite painfully. And I was able to watch myself and what was happening to me. So I suppose it's like you jump into another skin and you watch what's happening to you. And that became kind of fascinating for me because all I had was my mind, and that alone I possessed. And that was my only defense. It was my only escape. The only way out of where I was in, to go in very, very deeply. And that is as painful a process as physical torture is. But the end result, in a way, I reflect back, was quite healing because I was able to take myself to a place which was very rich, which was very illuminating, which was sometimes disturbing, but at all times revelatory. I used to wake in the morning and ask myself, have I got enough to get myself through the day? Thinking, after months and months and months of this, that I can't. But there always is. There is always more. We never reach the bitter end. The bitter end is just a thing on a ship that tells you when you throw out the anchor and it hits its bitter end, it just tells the sailor that there is more to go. But you're at a point and you know there's more to go. So, but Sally, that can become, I kind of began to understand that can be very dangerous to be able to take yourself to another place. We would have Freud defined madness as the flight from a terrible or traumatic reality to a safe place and the choice to stay there. So I had to come back. I had to put my hands out and touch the walls and confirm that this is where you are, Brian. It doesn't matter where you've been, this is where you are. But in that long process of finding a way out by going in, it's as if, to use a metaphor, my arms became wings. And I could, in a very real sense to me, fly out of that confinement and out of that cell over landscapes that I didn't know but were fascinating. So the mind is indeed, as Milton said, its own place, and then itself can make a heaven of hell or a hell of heaven. And I found that the power of the mind is greater than the butt end of a Kalashnikov or whatever else they wanted to use to beat you in. There is something, a residual powerhouse inside us. But sometimes the journey to find that place is difficult. But then bruises and bloody marks go away. In a way, Sally, I once talking about this, that it says in the Quran that when the Prophet is speaking to his followers about the taking of hostages, the Prophet says to his followers, give them, i.e. the captives, the Quran, that they might take with them when they go more than was taken from them. Well, I'm not a great believer in religious books, though I peruse their truth. But that's what happened. Not because of anything in the Quran, I'm not religious, but that's what happened. In the strange and terrifying irony, they gave me more than they took from me, and they didn't even know it.
Yes, these inadvertent things are amazing. I mean, when you were talking about stretching your arms and feeling the wings, what came to my mind was my friend Murray Hebert, who was a Canadian-American journalist. He was my colleague, and I lived in Singapore then, and he was in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, and he was, held accountable for a contempt of court. As journalists tend to run into these problems, and he was in jail for 3 months, or a few weeks, at least 6 weeks. And I asked him what it felt when he came out, and he said that when he came out, the hardest thing for him to realize was that he could cross the road when he wanted to, and he did not need anyone's permission. So the very fact that what's taken away is, in a sense, a dignity, and to wrest it back is a monumental achievement that you've shown, and through your writing and through your very brave act of going back to Lebanon, which is what I wanted to come back to. That you're thinking, and you've been working on for some time, writing a collection of stories, fiction about your time about Beirut, not about your time in Beirut necessarily. Now, the question I have is that does fiction offer you the freedom to say what you wish by imagining an alternative past or alternative future? What does fiction do that non-fiction cannot? And what is it that non-fiction offers that fiction cannot?
Okay. Fiction's harder. I would rather do 10 days on a building site than 10 minutes looking at a blank piece of paper. Fiction carries with it a terrible responsibility. Words are very important, and how we use them is very important, and how they are received. So the fiction writer has to create a communicable world with real people in them, with real issues. And the kind that I suppose for me, writing a fiction is like an act of confession. And I think that in writing, Sally, it's like you have a blueprint for a story that you're going to write. And then when you sit down in front of a blank piece of paper or the typewriter, whatever you work on, the tape recorder, and you begin, you have to allow the process to take charge. If you sit looking at the blueprint all the time, you won't really get a story that is revelatory or carries some sort of meaning beyond the words on the paper. So you have to find the capacity to trust the process in which you're engaged. And in many instances, what happens is you stray away from the blueprint you have, and you end up somewhere else. But that somewhere else you might not use in the story. But what it does is it gives you a vantage point from which to look at the story you intended to write from a different place. Also, when you trust the process, I think it engages you in personal change, because all the characters that you create are in some way related to yourself, because you have to have some kind of intellectual empathy when you're creating another human being, and emotional empathy. So trusting the process means letting the confession of writing change yourself. I once put it to a friend at another conference who was a writer, a poet, and we talked about writing. And I said to him, well, his first name was Sam. I said, Sam, the way I think about it is, the best of stories write themselves. You've just still got to allow that story to give itself to you, to create the space inside yourself to let the story talk to you. Then you have to do the work to shape it. And it's not really the confessional aspect, but am I sure that I'm saying what I want to say and what I want to be meaningful? And have I got the right moral authority to be creating this world, which I expect, which hope other people will come into or visit for a while. So I think writing facts are easier because they're your guiding line. You just follow along and kind of produce the facts in a way that are intelligible. What you're doing in fiction is you're creating a very real and tangible world, which is going to capture your reader and perhaps in some way take them to another place, which may involve them looking at themselves. I'm being honest. So I find it difficult, and the only way I can write is let the story talk itself to me. I have to be honest and allow it to change me. Stories, after all, are given to us, and we have to kind of honor that gift.
That's very interesting because, I suppose it's like going back to Shelley that, we look for before and after and find for what is not. Because I was talking some years ago and I've had several conversations with him, and he's also a Jaipur regular, Ramesh Gunasekar, the British Sri Lankan writer. And he had once said to me that, the ultimate virtual reality is a book. And since I've written nonfiction mainly, he said that you guys have it harder because you have to be accurate and get your facts right, and we can make stuff up. And I've always felt that making stuff up is harder, and he thinks the other. I suppose we always like what we don't. We always appreciate what the other one, and that's a sign of progress, I suppose. But because you are going back to a region that you were at and had obviously very sharp and some unpleasant, very extremely unpleasant memories, what is the role of memory in writing? To what extent is a fiction that you write set in Lebanon influenced by what happened to you, and to what extent is with all the reading you've done? And is it a way to recapture that remembered past, or is it something that you want to create completely out of blue?
Two things, Salil. When I decided to go back, there was a reason for it. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't because I was locked up for 5 years. I sat in 2006 and watched the saturation bombing of Israel on Lebanon. And I had once met and spoken to at length face to face with Ehud Olmert. At the time, he wasn't then Prime Minister of Israel, and I was very impressed by what he said at that time about the engineering of peace and accord with others. Unfortunately, when he took office, he just signed the signature to blanket bomb this. Two things struck me, Sally. The students that I had taught were not terrorists. Mm-hmm. I didn't know whether they were alive or not. And two, I had this unexpected feeling that something was being stolen from me. Mm-hmm. And whoever it was, fighter pilots or whoever, but not getting into the politics of it, but this was being stolen from me, and Lebanon owed me something. I didn't know what it was, but I was going to collect. So when I did decide to go back, I plainly had it in my head that I wasn't going to lay ghosts. I read an article by Elias Khoury, a quite brilliant Lebanese writer, mm-hmm. writes a bit like Tolstoy in a way, where he said in an interview in the New York Times review books, there are stories lying about the streets of Lebanon and Beirut that people care to pick them up. And what he was inferencing was that the Lebanese weren't not telling their own stories the way they should, for whatever reasons. And I decided, right, I'm going to take him at his word. So I went off. I traveled around Lebanon on my own. I had to go and get permission from Hezbollah of all places to go and visit some areas. And whatever story I found lying on the street, by however I recognized that story, that was a story I wrote. I'll give you one example. When I went back, I traveled with a young Lebanese man who had come to live in Dublin and study here the same year as I disappeared. He had not returned to Lebanon since, and I was going back. So he said, because he lived here in Dublin, he said, "Can I go with you?" He said, "Sure, come here, of course you can." Anyway, went back, and we went to Tripoli where he lived. And he was telling me the story of what was happening in the streets of Tripoli while I was locked up in a hole in the ground. And it was very interesting. We walked around. So he was telling me what was happening out in the world, which I had no awareness of. And then he said, as we walked down the street, which all the locals call the Champs-Élysées, and we were walking down, and he said, there was a cafe here, which everyone, the old men, went to in the morning to play damas. And he said, once 10 o'clock came, everyone cleared and went home, because that's when the shooting started. And he said they would shoot at anything. a piece of paper, a newspaper blowing in the wind, they would shoot it to bits. Cats running down across the street, they would shoot it to bits. Just shot at anything. But he told me, he said, so the old man were playing dominoes here, 10 o'clock come, clear, silence. And then he said, but the owner of the cafe put his son out on the street in a chair with a sign around his neck saying, I am a donkey. And so the shooting began. And I thought, hi, what was going on there? You know, a father puts his son out in the street and bullets flying all around the place. And I said to my friend, what happened? He said, I don't know. I left Lebanon. I don't know what happened to him. So anyway, I let that pass and went on traveling around to find the other stories. But it kept coming back to me. Why was this boy put on the street? What was the significance of this sign? The boy was going to get shot, that's for sure. Why would a father do this? And so I began to tell the story, why this happened. And the story got longer and longer. And it became a kind of, I don't know, it became a kind of novelette or a kind of a way of exploring the issues, the dynamics of human relationships that are mirrored in some strange way in the balance in civil war in the streets. But it was one just personal story, and I became fascinated by it. So that was one. Anytime I'm in Lebanon, I go up into the mountains to the Qadeshi Valley, which is a stunning place, absolutely stunning. And I have never known why I keep going there. And then I realized it was something to do with the great poet Khalil Gibran. He lived there and he grew up there. And I thought, what's the connection with this? And when I was a boy in Belfast at 15 or 16, 14, I remember picking up a book of poems by Khalil Gibran. And I thought, that's a strange connection. So I wrote a story about meeting the ghost of Khalil Gibran. And I talk about his life and his writings and why he wrote through his paintings, not his poetry, because he was a very fine painter. So those are the kind of things, the stories you find lying about the street, and they take possession of you. And you have to write them because that's the gift that's given. And like most things, when a gift is given, there's a responsibility on you to share it some way. So I did that, but one of those strange things I'm trying to come to about this thing about memory, part of my survival in Lebanon was dreaming. Because you can go into your dreams to get out of the place where. And when I came back, I didn't really have nightmares or stuff. I didn't have panic attacks. But I missed the lucid dreaming that I had had for so long. But so that had all gone. And when I went back all those years later, suddenly all this lucid dreaming came back. That's something I still don't understand. It had nothing to do with the place. I wasn't looking for ghosts and they didn't worry me. But suddenly the dreaming mind came back very lush and very sensuous. And I thought, well, in a way, I suppose dreaming gives you the landscape of language that day-to-day life doesn't have. So I let the dreams, wherever they were coming from, tell stories to me. And there was a story about meeting an old man who was running an art gallery in Ashrafia. But all the paintings on his wall were by Gustav Klimt. And when I went into the gallery, because I liked Klimt's painting, he was playing Mahler music. And we talked, and I thought, how ironic. Here's all these images by a Jewish painter. This Lebanese man is playing Mahler, a Jewish musician, which was very moving beside the painting. And I thought, there's got to be a story here. So that formed all the story. And there's a few more, but they were the happenings. I didn't go with a blueprint. I just went to find the stories that were lying in the street because that's what Lebanon owed me.
Right. We have 2 minutes before we go and take some questions from the audience. But before I do that, I do have one last question. So if you can, I mean, I have several more, but I do want to ask this question to you, which is the power that the hostage has over the captor, because I know at least a couple of other political prisoners through my work with the writers who have been in prison through, I've got to know them very well in my work with Penn. And one of the things that I hear is that they do have a strange power. So if you, what that power is, and the other is, of course, if and when you do meet the captors again, what is the kind of thing you tell them? I mean, what is it that you want them to know?
I've often thought when I sometimes when I was walking around the streets of Lebanon, I kept looking at people saying, "Was it you? Was it you?" But then I thought, well, if Saeed was a very, very brutal man, quite malicious, deeply disturbed. But if he came up to me in the street and introduced himself, I think I would probably say to him, sit down and have a coffee. And then I would look him directly in the eye, which I've never been able to do, and say, Saeed, you tell me what you were thinking when you done those things to me. And if you can, and if you will, I can set you free, Saeed.
Mm.
You know, you kind of take on things. And after all, I've been in very deep, disturbed psychological places myself. So I kind of knew where he might be. But I have this profound sense that if he could talk that out to me, that I could set him free, take all that pain off him. I don't know whether that will ever happen.
Yeah, but this is exactly what Mathida, who is a very good friend of mine, and she's also often at the Jaipur Festival from Myanmar, and she was in jail for 5.5 years in Burma during the military years, and she used to say that she was being interrogated, she was being questioned all the time, and she would say, "Keep at it and keep doing it." And the police investigator actually told her that you're making us your prisoner. And so there is a very strange power that comes through. And I mean,
absolutely,
have the power to make him free is very powerful and very important. We have a question. There are several questions here, and I'm going to turn to the first one here from Sachdev Ramakrishna to you, Brian. That with having John McCarthy as your company, was it a reasonable solace for you? And what is your view of the countries of your citizenship, which were not quite forthcoming in their effort for your release? Now, I understand one reason was that UK in particular in those days had a very strong view about not negotiating with what they call extremist and terrorist organizations. So those are the two in one. And I do have a few more, and we have a few more minutes. So if you can respond to these, yeah.
Well, I'm an Irish citizen, so I kind of got very angry I had been taken because Ireland's got nothing to do with what was going on out there. And I went on hunger strike for a very long time because they wouldn't tell me why they were keeping me. And then when they told me about the bombing of Gaddafi's palace in Tripoli, I just said, that's got to do with me. I'm Irish, nothing to do with me. So part of the problem with that was I told them I was Irish, but shortly after I was taken, because I was born in Belfast, Margaret Thatcher said another British citizen has been taken in Lebanon, so therefore I became a spy. And they now had evidence that I was a spy. So that made life very difficult for me. I was with McCarthy for quite a long time. And look, John is a very well-spoken Englishman, awful English. And I've often said, if I had met him in the street before this happened, I wouldn't have liked him, and he would not have liked me. But under those circumstances, I said to him when we were putting the cell together, if you don't survive here, John, I won't. And if I don't survive here, you won't. We both quickly understood that survival is mutual, and that's what we need to get through this. You need to survive, and I need to help you, and I need to survive, and you need to help me. And therefore, the British and Irish question was answered right away.
Yes, I mean, I only wish the politicians who took the Brexit decision would think practically than that. But I mean, Fintan O'Toole, of course, from Ireland, has been writing magnificently about it for the last few years. The next question is from Om Prakash Parikh, who asked whether, do you think that as a writer, that language can convey the traumatic experience that you've been through during your confinement? Where do the words come from, and do the words help? How easy it is to encapsulate the experience in language?
Well, I think possibly for myself, as a young man, I always liked reading poetry because of its intensity and because of the images that poets can throw up in a few words. It's like a painter puts 2 or 3 colors together and it changes. So I kind of had that. And I think you need to find words that are not in sort of everyday common usage, because what you're writing about is not an everyday common experience. However, when you live in a very heightened reality, your mind works in a very heightened capacity. So I was able, I suppose, to draw from that well of words and poetry that I read when I was a young man. Always been fascinated by the power of words. And here I was in a place where I could create whatever I wanted to. So I think the other thing was, Sally, when I came back and sat down to think about writing this book, I really didn't know how to write about a time when nothing happens. Take you out of your cell to bring you back, turn the light out, that's it, to the next day. But everything happens in here and in here. How do you write about that? So whatever blueprint I planned wasn't doing it for me. So somebody said to me, a painter friend of mine said to me in a kind of throwaway phrase, just be brutally honest, Brian. And in that phrase, just be brutally honest, was okay. So I allowed myself, I lived in a small cottage in the west of Ireland. There was nobody near me. I went out at night, I couldn't see anything because it was dark. And very much in a way, it was like being back in that bad place in Lebanon. And I, in whatever kind of psychological shift you make, transported myself back to that worst of all possible times to try and take hold of it. So it was a matter of, I knew what that story was because I experienced it. All I needed to do was tell it back to myself and let myself speak to me the way I had spoken to myself in the cell. And I think the language comes to you.
Yep.
Because if you try and dress things up, Sally, it doesn't work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You've said stories come to you, languages come to you. You spoke about dreams, which was very important because in your memoir that you've written, you do talk about nightmares. So moving from nightmares to dreams itself is a very important journey. I think we have time for one question and maybe one more, but I'll take the first one here from Rohan. And in a way, the question he asked takes us back to something you said early on. And the question is, now the screen has moved, so let me just push it back a little. Yes. Would you draw an analogy between what was going on in Ireland and in Lebanon, given the fact that there were explosions and certainly cases of torture? And the reason I'm linking it is with one of the first things you said, that when you went from Belfast to Beirut, and I think you said that it was like going from the frying pan to fire. So were there parallels you saw, or was it a completely different universe?
I think Belfast is not Beirut, and they're not comparable. And I've been in both places, and I've been at the cutting edge in both places. When I walked to the university in the morning to my teaching job, I would see bodies in the street from the previous night's fighting. Everybody was carrying guns in broad daylight, even young men. Everybody had a pistol down the small of their back, or they were carrying Kalashnikov. This was a city, in kind of collapse. There wasn't any sense of joint purpose. Everybody was at each other's throats, and it was bedlam and mayhem, and it was filled with blood and murder. Belfast didn't have that. My father went to work, and I went to work while all the troubles were going on. And there were certain areas of the cities that certain people didn't go to, but people were able to articulate their agenda and their reasons and why they were doing things, whether you accepted them or not. They were able to kind of give a historical and political perspective. It seemed to me that in Lebanon, people didn't really know, and they weren't able, certainly not to me, to articulate either why I was held or what was happening. It was like everybody was living on frayed nerves, and the only way they got through the day was twitching a pistol in their hand. So I just couldn't see it. I remember going to the movies in Lebanon. All these young men were sitting there, and they were watching Rambo or whatever. And remember, their whole world is fixated on these American movies. These shoot 'em up, blow 'em up stuff. And whenever some guy came up with a gun, they would be able to name the gun, especially what it was and who made it, and that. And I thought, here's part of the problem. It's the world that they see, the world that they receive, and there's just murder on that back, So, you come to a kind of understanding that, look, we have the science, we can map the human genome, the human body, we can articulate and everything about it. But there isn't one gene in the human body that defines or makes a terrorist. There isn't a terrorist gene. John Donne, the great poet, said, "A twisted nerve, a ganglion gone wrong, predestinates a sinner or the saint." I don't know. Terrorists, sinners are all socially made. There are kind of social circumstances for why these things happen. And it's just people's inability to articulate their grievance and other people's refusal to listen to what that grievance is. And what happens?
That is so powerful. That is so powerful in our current time, given the unrest about racism around the world, unrest about inequality, and the unrest about who is being sent to work and so on. Inability to listen, inability to address long-standing grievances is at the heart of many of the problems that we are faced with. The most powerful image that I get from you, this is the second time we've spoken and I've read your books, is the one of the candle. Even if it's a small candle, it lights and it illuminates. And you've been a candle. You've been illuminating everyone. Thank you so much for your time. We had more questions, but I'm afraid we have to stop. And over to you, Sanjay. And thank you again, Brian.
Time goes far too quick, Salil.
Indeed, it does.
Take care, my friend.
Thank you so much, Brian Keenan, and thank you so much, Salil Tripathi. And absolutely, like you said, there is no terrorist DNA stamped into our being, and it's really an issue of being able to listen. But also our hearts and prayers go out to all of those other people who are incarcerated against the will across the world, even as we speak, in the safety of our homes through social media. And to them, more strength to whatever they're fighting for, whatever they're standing for. And to PEN and all of the PEN colleagues across the world, I think, who've been also doing an incredible job bringing their voices for the rest of us to be able to understand and take forward. Thank you both. That was a really special session, and I'm sorry we couldn't send you all of the questions, but perhaps we will do later. Thank you to our official radio partners, Red FM Bajate Raho. And please do remember to log in on Wednesday, the 22nd of July, for another set of great sessions. The World's War, Forgotten Soldiers of Empire. David Olusuga, in conversation with Yasmin Khan, describes how Europe's Great War became the World's War, a multiracial, multinational struggle fought in Africa and Asia as well as in Europe, which pulled in men and resources from across the globe, especially paraphernalia of the era's racial obsessions, which dictated which men would serve, how they would serve, and to what degree they would suffer. As vivid and moving as it is revelatory and authoritative, the World's War explores the experiences and sacrifices of 4 million non-European, non-white people whose stories have remained too long in the shadows. This will be at 7 p.m. Indian Standard Time, 2:30 p.m. British Summer Time, and 9:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And our second session on 26th of July will be Anita Nair, writer's coup in conversation with Ashok Ferry, takes us through the inspirations and teachings of her creative journey, spanning from the anchor of her Malayali roots to the range of her prolific literary repertoire, spanning from fiction and poetry to children's books and travel writing, to the fundamental nature of writers and all those who strive to tell stories. This will be at 8:30 p.m. IST, 4 p.m. British Summer Time, and 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Stay safe and see you on Wednesday.